Welcome to the Covenant Podcast. The Covenant Podcast exists to equip listeners with theological content from a 1689 Baptist perspective. My name is Austin McCormick. I'm one of the pastors of Covenant Baptist Church in Clarksville, Tennessee. You are listening to the Covenant Podcast on the Man of God Network, brought to you by Covenant Baptist Theological Seminary. And today I have the special privilege to welcome Dr. Austin Walker back to the podcast. Welcome to the podcast, Austin.
Thank you.
It's
good to be back.
It's a great privilege to talk with you again. I really enjoyed reading your book earlier this year on Robert Hall, and that's not the topic of this conversation, but I would encourage our listeners to go back and listen to that one and to pick up that book and read it. But the topic of our conversation today is a new book that you've authored titled Hot Water, and we'll get into the content of this book in just a moment. But can you just give us a brief update on this season of your life and ministry before we get into that part of our conversation?
Yeah, sure. I'm getting on in years. I'm now in my 78th year. I'm an active member with my wife in Castlefields Church in Derby, where I preach occasionally. I preached yesterday evening. I preached there around once a month. I'm active in a local fraternal. I speak there sometimes. I've recently concluded a series of sermons I've got one left, I hasten to add, on Isaiah chapter 52 into chapter 53, the fourth servant song. Last Friday, I was privileged to resume a ministry which I thought was long gone. I was on a session which has been loosely called Zoom Africa, which meant that I was speaking to, well, we don't know how many men there were, pastors and church leaders from across West Africa, East Africa, Central Africa, Southern Africa, seeking to equip them to be faithful ministers of the Word of God. I was speaking on lessons learned from a long ministry. I gave 2 sessions, and I'm not finished, so I'm up again for the 3rd session in February. There was too much material and some very interesting questions. So I press on day by day. I don't enjoy the greatest of health, but I'm just thankful for the opportunities I have to still write. And I write book reviews, I write articles. I'm not sure if there'll be any more books, but this may be the last book on Baptist history. I don't know. Depends how many more years and how much energy the Lord gives me. But that's where I'm at the moment. So,
yeah, thank you for that. Very helpful. And as I mentioned in our introduction, the topic of our conversation today is your newest book, the one that has recently been published by Broken Wharf, titled Hot Water, the Baptismal Controversy of the 1690s and its relevance for today. What led you to study this subject, brother?
Okay, it probably should be renamed A Baptist Controversy rather than The Baptist Controversy. I noticed that only too late, but it doesn't really matter. What led me, almost what you might call an accident. It's an offshoot of my earlier studies of Benjamin Keach. Benjamin Keach, of course, was a significant London pastor in the from 1670, 1890s into the 18th century to his death in 1704. This book is about a controversy with him and a man called William Burkitt. Now, I had no idea really who Burkitt was. Keach wrote a book called The Rector Rectified and Corrected. And that was dealing with this rector's understanding of baptism and the nature of the church. While I was on a tour of Essex, I think it was with my son and Dr. Michael Haykin and one of his friends, I believe, we were taking them around Essex, which was a Puritan stronghold in the 17th century. And we were in Dedham, famed for John Rogers in the 16th century. And I suddenly saw this plaque in the church. And it was the wife and the husband, Burkitt. And I thought, hang on a minute, I know that name. William Burkitt became the rector and lecturer in Dedham after this controversy. And it suddenly twigged. And I shouted out to Michael Haykin, he's the rector rectified and corrected. And we sort of compared notes and we agreed. So it was really almost accidental that we happened to be traveling around Dedham, and I suddenly realized that this William Burkitt was the rector who Keach had actually sought to correct and rectify. So I researched William Burkitt a little bit more, tried to find out what this controversy was really about, how it arose. And I thought in the end, I got enough notes here to make a little book of it. So that's what you've got in front of you now.
Very interesting. Yeah. Living over here in the central part of America, I feel like I don't get to have the same privileges of happening upon some of the Puritans. So very cool to have a lot of the English church history there in your country. Thankful to the Lord for these providences where you can see places where some of these men lived, and to have access to researching some of the historical happenings around that area. You've began to introduce our audience to William Burkitt, but perhaps do you want to say a little bit more about who he was and what his view of baptism was?
William Burkitt was a thoroughgoing Anglican Puritan. And he believed firmly that infant baptism was the door into the Church of the Lord Jesus Christ. He was born in 1650, which is a decade after Benjamin Keach. He became the rector of a parish called Milden in Suffolk. And he was there from 1672 until 1692 when he moved over to Dedham. He was a Cambridge graduate. Because he was an Anglican, of course, he was allowed to go to Cambridge and Oxford, something dissenters were not permitted to do. He had no qualms at all about his Anglican convictions. He was a very close friend of William Gurnall, the man who wrote The Christian in Complete Armour. That was in a neighbouring parish in Lavenham. And in fact, Burkitt preached Gurnall's funeral sermon. They were good friends, close friends. After 1692, which is after this controversy, he became the vicar and the lecturer at Dedham. I think fairly recently, Burkitt's New Testament commentary has actually been reprinted. George Whitefield used it an awful lot, valued it quite highly. But Burkitt believed that infants should be baptized. And as far as I can determine, he was in full sympathy with the prayer book that pronounced infants baptized, that they then were not only recognized as members of the church, but they were actually regenerate, a kind of form of baptismal regeneration. If you're not familiar with the prayer book and all the rubric that goes in there, it's quite clear to me, and quite clear to a lot of other people too, that teaches baptismal regeneration. Spurgeon certainly thought that. in his famous 1864 sermon on baptismal regeneration. Now, when a man, and we don't know much about him, but his name was John Treadwell. We think John Treadwell was sent from one or more of the London particular Baptist churches, sent to be an evangelist in Suffolk. And he began to preach in an adjacent parish to Mildon, where William Burkitt was. And his aim and his sending him was to establish a Baptist congregation. William Burkitt got to hear about this preaching and regarded this man Treadwell as an intruder, stealing sheep from the Anglican fold. And he got very annoyed and angry to find that John Treadwell, was in this neighbouring parish. Now, John Treadwell had written to William Burkitt, and he expected a reply, but a reply never came. So one day, William Burkitt stormed into the Baptist meeting and demanded that they listen to him, denounce them, and defend his understanding of infant baptism. He then wrote a tract, a book, and that was really his reply to Treadwell. Treadwell asked to see him, but it does not appear that that meeting ever took place. So John Treadwell turned back to his London friends and asked Benjamin Keach if he would answer this book of William Burkitt's and deal with the proper subjects and the proper mode, as they understood it, of baptism. So that's what that's some of the background, and that's Burkitt was obviously a significant figure in Suffolk, and he was a Cambridge graduate, so he was no unlearned man, but he was a staunch Anglican, stuck with the prayer book to the letter, it seems to me. So that's some of the background. That's who Burkitt was, and as I say, he's known for this Baptist commentary. He's known for this New Testament commentary, which, as I say, has gone through a number of editions, and I believe has had a recent publication.
It's very helpful. Thank you for introducing our audience to William Burkitt. Perhaps in this book, at least, the lesser of the two known figures, at least from our audience, who are largely Baptists or Reformed Baptists or particular Baptists. And like I'm saying, our audience is very likely familiar to Benjamin Keach, especially thanks to a work that you've authored titled The Excellent Benjamin Keach. But perhaps can you say just a little bit more about who Benjamin Keach was for our listeners who may not know who he is? And then after that, provide our listeners with an overview of how Keach responded to Burkitt's view of baptism.
Right. Benjamin Keach, very interesting character. He was born in 1640 to the north of London, in a county called Buckinghamshire. His father was a church warden in the parish church. He was converted through the ministry of a man called Matthew Mead. Some of you may have heard of Matthew Mead. He eventually ended up in London, in East London, as a pastor, congregational pastor, if I'm not mistaken, in the days of the Commonwealth. After his conversion, Benjamin Keach basically left the Anglican communion, and he began to become a preacher among those whom we now know and call General Baptists, who were quite prominent in his home area. He was persecuted. He was tried at the Buckinghamshire Quarter Sessions in 1664, and part of it was, you teach infant baptism and you deride the Anglican Church, you don't attend it. He was put in the pillory, which was a fairly standard punishment in those days, but not very pleasant. Because of increasing persecution in the 1660s, Benjamin Keach almost lost his life, but he decided the best thing to do was to depart for London. The area where he lived around Winslow, Winslow was only 3,000 people or so. It's very difficult to conceal yourself in such a small place. So he decided to take his family to London, where he could be lost in the crowds, as it were. He became a pastor on the south bank of the River Thames in an area called Southwark, and he became a particular Baptist, seemingly after his contact. His first wife died, and his second wife seemed to introduce him in some way to particular Baptist doctrine. And Hansard Knowles, in particular, he married them, seems to have had a strong influence upon him. And when Keach said, "I understood the covenant of grace," he then became a convinced particular Baptist. He pastored a church in a place strangely called Horsley Down in Southwark, which subsequently became the congregation that we know as Spurgeon's congregation in the Metropolitan Tabernacle, which lies a few miles south of Southwark and Horsley Down. Benjamin Keach was a significant writer and publisher. He published some 50 different works. Mostly they are sermons, but not exclusively so. And a lot of books, a number of books on baptism. Whenever there was an issue, it seems they turned to Keach. Can you write an answer to this particular book and these particular arguments? And he did that quite frequently. In London, he became one of the prominent leaders of the particular Baptist movement, if I can call it that, along with William Kiffin and Hansard Knowles, Hercules Collins, and other men of that stature. He was one of the men who was party to organizing the 1689 National Assembly. And he was one of the signatories of people call it the 1689, but it was really the 1675 Second London Baptist Confession of Faith. And to say he then lived after the Act of Toleration in 1689. He then lived another 15 years and died in London in 1704. So he was a significant man. He was involved in a number of controversies and issues, but he was a preacher of the gospel of Christ first and foremost. Now, you've asked me to say how did he respond to William Burkitt. I think we've got to remember that in the 1690s, there still was a tremendous amount of hostility to Baptists. The ghost of Munster, the Anabaptists of the 16th century, was still haunting the Baptists and continued to do so into the 18th century. Despite all the protestations that they made to the contrary, that they were not Anabaptists, people still labeled them that and opposed to them. And I think that probably Burkitt put them in that category. I think it's helpful for us to realize, and I'll make a quotation here. This is one of the things I put in the back of this book Hot Water was the quotations of Keach and on the nature of the church and on infant baptism. Because I think it's significant that what we need to realize is that the chief cornerstone of the national church, the Anglican Church, was infant baptism. And Keach was arguing really not only against infant baptism, but he was arguing about the nature of the true Church of Christ. And he saw the two things very closely connected. On page 61, there's a quotation in this book on hot water from another book he wrote against a man called James Owen, Light Broke Forth in Wales. It's fairly extensive, but let me read it to you because it summarizes really the issue. He says, I look upon infant baptism to be one of the chief pillars of the Romish Church and of all national churches and constitutions in the European world. This is that Christendom that is so cried up and the way of making and continuing the pretended Christian name. In the anti-Christian church and world, all are made Christian in their infant baptism, and thus the inhabitants of the earth are cheated and deluded with a shadow and empty name that signifies nothing. And certain I am, until Christendom, as it is called, is unchristianized of this pretended right, or Christendom, there will never be a thorough reformation, I mean until they see that Christianity or Christian name, which they received at their infant baptism, signifies nothing, but throw it away as a human innovation and labor after true regeneration or a likeness to Christ, and so believe and are baptized upon the profession of their faith, according as in the apostolic primitive church. 'Tis infant baptism that tends to uphold all national churches and deceives poor people who think they were hereby made Christians. That really is the essence of what Keach believed, and in his answer then to Burkitt, he followed that through. Keach rejected the 1662 prayer book and rejected baptismal regeneration, and he rejected Burkitt's notion that infants who were baptized possessed an habitual faith. And he spent a long time, and the arguments that he used are not easy to follow. If you try and follow the book, he argues from point by point by point. It's tedious to work your way through it all, but it can be summarized because, he's basically saying this is the nature of the church. It's made up of believers. It's made up of regenerate members who have been baptized as believers. That is a true church. And he rejected sprinkling as the mode of baptism. And then he concluded in his book with a section to Christian parents, laying out quite clearly they should not submit their children to infant baptism. So I've tried to spell out what Burkitt believed and taught, and then spell out argument by argument what Keach did by way of reply. But I think it would be tedious if I tried to repeat all that this afternoon, especially as it's only a thin book, so readers can read it for themselves and plough their way through. But if you really want to test your abilities, see if you'll probably find the books online. But to read it through Burkitt is tedious, and some of the ways in which they argued and Keach argued, they are tedious to follow and difficult to follow. So I tried to summarize, what he was saying. But I think the key thing is to understand it's not just infant baptism. It's what is the church? What is the Church of Jesus Christ? That was Keach's principal concern, really.
Very helpful. Yes, we encourage our listeners to pick up a copy of this book. We'll link in the show notes to various places where you can get a copy of this book for yourself and read through it. But we do want to ask you, what lessons can we learn from this controversy on baptism?
A lot. In the 1690s, of course, Baptists were fighting for their identity and for their existence. We're not in that situation now today. Baptists are found in almost every continent of the world, and we are accepted as part of the Christian church worldwide. But nevertheless, you have to look back and be thankful for men who fought and had to fight. They were persecuted, they were vilified, they were scorned, they were ridiculed. And we need to respect them and thank God for them. They were willing to do that all those years ago. But does it really matter what we believe now, today? Is this controversy just an academic, historic interest? I don't believe so. If you look at the final chapter of Hot Water, I've included some comments there by a man called Hugh Stowell Brown, who preached in 1861 at the Metropolitan Tabernacle opening from Colossians 2:12. And I think Spurgeon chose Stowell to preach because he had been an Anglican. His father had been an Anglican before him, but he left the Church of England in 1846 and became a Baptist. So I think probably Spurgeon thought he would be a good man to preach at the opening and to preach in such a way that he identifies us and himself as a Baptist. Stowell asked the question, is baptism essential to salvation? Categorically, no. But infant baptism is important, and I think it is still important. Infant baptism is the main root of superstition and destructive dogma and of baptismal regeneration. That is what he said. That's a quotation, I think, that's on page 42 here. Yeah. I think in every generation, we need to underscore that being a Christian is not a matter of having Christian parents. It's not a matter of being baptized as an infant. It's not a matter of attending a church and being confirmed then in your teenage years when the bishop lays hands upon you. Because if the gospel is not preached, these sorts of ideas begin to gain the ascendancy. So many people assume they've been baptized as an infant, then they're safe, they're in heaven, will go to heaven. And they never go to church, but they have this wishful thinking, this idea that they've been done, as it were. They've been baptized, they're part of the Church of England. I think that idea is declining as people turn against the church more and more. But you still find people who will hold to that view. And it's important that we stand against that and emphasize that true true regeneration of the Spirit of God, leading to faith and repentance. Repentance towards God, turning away from our sin, and then faith in Jesus Christ, crucified on the cross for us. That is the mark of a true Christian. Hugh Stoll Brown dealt with Colossians 2:12. He dealt with the whole subject of circumcision. Now, circumcision, of course, lies at the heart of the infant Baptist argument. They would argue that the Abrahamic covenant and circumcision is a basis and ground for promoting infant baptism. He dealt with that subject and showed very clearly that circumcision there is not the equivalent of infant baptism. It's the equivalent of New Testament, what I would call New Testament regeneration and conversion to God. And that's very, very important. We must remember too that one of the reasons why Spurgeon became a Baptist, I mean, he was brought up a Congregationalist, and his father and grandfather, he saw it quite simply. Baptism as a believer is a matter of obedience to Christ. And he rejected, as many of the hearers, the listeners today will know, he preached this famous sermon on baptismal regeneration in 1864. And that was probably his best-selling sermon. And J.C. Ryle, of course, who was a noted Anglican bishop, called him a cheeky fellow for preaching in that way. But Spurgeon was right. You only need to go and read the prayer book and the rubric for baptism, infant baptism. And, this child is now regenerate. It's in black and white there in the prayer book. So I think we could summarize it by saying that for these men, for Stoll, for Spurgeon, for Keach, for us, the two key questions always are, what is a Christian? And secondly, what is the true gospel church? Who are its members? How do you enter into it? And those questions are relevant for every single generation of Christians. I once was involved when I was a pastor in Crawley in England, in Sussex. I was part of a broad evangelical fraternal, and we were asked to go and join the local ecumenical fraternal. And some of the men said, waste of time. I said, no, let's go and talk to them, listen to them. All right, we'll do that as long as you are prepared to be our spokesman. I said, fine. So we went, and we sat there, and I sat there and listened to these men arguing why we should join this local ecumenical fraternal. And I thought, after about half an hour, 40 minutes, I raised my hand and said, friends, I have two questions. And I think if we could agree on those, then we might be able to go forward. And my two questions were, what is a Christian? And what is the nature of the true gospel church? The meeting ended about 10 minutes later. There was no further discussion because they knew, as we knew, there was no way forward because of those things. But most of those men would have been infant Baptists. Many of them were Anglicans, one or two were Catholics, and one or two were other men in some of the other denominations. But it was a non-starter once we raised those sorts of questions, and that's the question that Keach was desperate to answer in the 1690s. That's why he stood his ground against William Burkitt, Richard Baxter, James Owen, and other people. You can see, if you look in my book on Keach, the excellent Benjamin Keach, you'll see the different works that he wrote largely in the 1690s, although he's arguing with Baxter long before that over the nature of baptism, the subjects of baptism. But, it was a crucial question then, and it is a crucial question now. And we must maintain that carefully, thoroughly, and defend it biblically and preach accordingly.
Amen. This has been an excellent conversation. I do once again encourage our listeners to pick up a copy of your book. But to wrap up this conversation, I want to give you an opportunity to leave our listeners with any final thoughts or encouragements pertaining to your book or anything else we've been discussing today. So what final thoughts do you have?
Well, it's been a very short conversation, but it's only a short book. It's easy to read, I hope. And anyway, but I think you would find the most helpful part of it, if you're interested in the historical links, the most helpful part will be the quotations from Keach's works on baptism and the church. I collected those over a period of many years. Every time I found a reference, I noted it down, and I thought, that's worth putting somewhere in a book. So it's there as an appendix in this little volume. But I just commend that to you as the listeners today. It'll help you understand what those issues were, and I hope it will help you in your ministries, if you are a preacher, to realize what the key questions are. I think it's very dangerous to assume that everybody you are preaching to is converted, and you need to ask them, when did you become a Christian? You ask that of someone who's been baptized as an infant, they will either tell you, well, when I was baptized, or they will say, well, they'll hedge around that question because they have no experience of becoming a Christian. That's there was a man who was a leader in the Anglican Church, thoroughgoing evangelical, and he went to this congregation, and it really was a mixed bag. And he had the courage to ask them, as he interviewed them, when did you become a Christian? And it really created more than a few ripples. And he saw a lot of people genuinely converted because they were resting in their baptism as infants. It's a lie. It's deception. It's keeps people away from Christ. And that was part of Keach's great concern, that people will be genuinely converted. That's why Treadwell went originally to Suffolk to preach the gospel. He was sent out. Our London Baptist friends sent men out as evangelists to plant churches and to preach the gospel. And that got them into trouble with some of these Anglican brethren. I have no doubt in my own mind that Burkitt was a genuine Christian. You could use his commentary on the New Testament with some profit, but on the subject of infant baptism, I think he was greatly mistaken and in error, and we need to be aware of that and stand against that. Okay.
Dr. Walker, thank you for carving out some time to have this conversation with me. It's good to have you back on the podcast. Great to talk with you again today.
Thank you very much.
And to our listeners, we do thank you for tuning into this conversation titled Hot Water with Austin Walker. We wish you grace and peace. God bless.